I am Jeff Lindsay. I was going to introduce myself because I wasn't sure what to tell her how to introduce me as, but I've basically a strange generalist and entrepreneur and web developer, and I currently work at NASA Ames on some cool web stuff. I also started Super Happy Dev House, which is a cool party for hackers and thinkers. And I've done some other stuff, but you've probably never heard of it. Although you might have heard of webhooks. I don't know. Is this a familiar concept with anybody here? Okay, a couple of you. And the rest of you are just like curious what this thing is? Okay. Well, you'll find out. So I guess I'm the, at least right now, the main evangelist behind this concept. 3 years ago, I kind of was just thinking about HTTP callbacks, and I kind of just gave it this name of webhooks, and I guess fairly recently people have started to get excited about them for some reason. So the point of this is to kind of share what they are and why they're significant, and what's going on in this sort of like growing ecosystem of webhooks. So I've given a version of this talk before, and this time I kind of want to emphasize the programmable part because that's kind of a major influence for why this was significant to me in the first place, because a lot of people are associating this with other things that aren't exactly what it's about. So I was told by a friend of mine that he was reading about webhooks, and he got really excited about them. And then he went to find out what exactly they are, and he got really disappointed. And what I think I'm describing is a a game changer, but it's based on a mechanism that really takes one line of code to describe. So it seems really simple, and so people think it can only do simple things when it's quite the contrary, as Go would be an example of, simple mechanics creating rich dynamics. So the point of this talk is to share the implications of this as well as like what it is. So notice I'm dancing around it because that's how I roll. So at the high level, I was kind of inspired by, 1997, John Udell was talking about websites as data sources that can be reused and remixed. And today that idea isn't very novel. But he kind of talked about, a new programming paradigm that takes the whole internet as its platform. And this was very interesting to me. And it kind of manifested recently, or at 2005-ish era, as the programmable web, or the web as the platform. And in 2005, John Musser started tracking APIs and mashups that were on the web, and now there's over 1,000 APIs, and it's growing at a pretty nice rate. So APIs and mashups, I guess, have become the foundation of the programmable web, or are they? After thinking about webhooks and fairly recently thinking about the programmable web, I realized that APIs and mashups don't really make a programmable web. They make a programmatic web. And so, for example, the Twitter API lets us use Twitter programmatically, but it doesn't let you program Twitter to do more. So my argument is kind of like webhooks will bring about the real programmable web. So what are they? I mentioned HTTP callbacks, but here's a little scenario. So we have a web service here, and his name is Twicker. And the user's like, cool, sign me up. All right, you're all set. Now listen, I might find myself with some data that you might be interested in that's relevant to you. What do you want me to do with it? And so the user says, all right, hold on a sec. And he goes off and he hacks up some script and he comes back and says, could you just post it here whenever you have any? And the web service is like, sure, why not? But what's at the URL? And the user says, well, it's a tiny handler I put up on App Engine. And the web service says, well, what does it do? And the user says, it doesn't matter to you. It does whatever I want. That's kind of the point. Webhooks are just simple user-defined HTTP callbacks. But you see what this does is it makes the web service become extensible, and it makes the user become empowered. A friend of mine was trying to get me to explain webhooks to her. And she's not a programmer, but she has an iPhone. So after explaining this to her, she compared it to jailbreaking the iPhone. And I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, I guess that kind of works. It's letting users do what they want with it, customize it, add applications, etc. So having webhooks in your web service is like jailbreaking your web app. It's opening functional extensibility. So to describe the core mechanic of webhooks is very simple. So this is a pseudocode example of what the heart of implementing webhooks looks like. And you can dress this up in lots of ways, and there's reasons why you would want to dress this up. But it's very simple. You're making an HTTP request to a user-specified URL on major events. PayPal is probably one of the oldest webhook implementers. Their instant payment notification is a webhook. They describe it when a customer pays you, PayPal posts a notification to your server at a URL you specify. And it's framed as a notification, just kind of like how I described webhooks when I started writing about it, but it doesn't properly imply the usage it's intended for, which is integration. So I'll come back to that. So I started thinking about this in 2006, kind of inspired by PayPal and some projects that I was working on. And it was kind of like I saw a lot of what it could do, and I was like, well, this is really awesome. Why isn't this all over the place? Why aren't there webhooks everywhere? And I felt like I was taking crazy pills, and I would tell people about it, and they'd be like, yeah, that's why not? And I guess today I know why it wasn't recognized. Is it's just so it's such an abstract idea, and it's like it can be used for anything, right? And people don't get that, they need concrete examples. And so over the past 3 years, there's more and more people have been implementing webhooks, and I can basically point those examples out. So comparing it to REST, SOAP versus REST, they've been around a lot longer than the graph shows, but REST is much simpler. In fact, you could describe it as using HTTP properly, but it wasn't until it got a name that it could really be used in discourse to make it popular. And so that's kind of what I was doing by giving webhooks a name. And so now we're talking about it, and there's now starting to be a discussion about it. And actually, REST APIs and webhooks are kind of two sides of the same coin, and they complement each other in ways that I'll get to later. But so I just want to give it this name and start associating some ideas with it. And so now that was all just introduction. I've split this talk into 3 sections, and these are basically different general ways you can use webhooks. So the first one is push, because this is kind of what a lot of people are talking about right now. They're talking about push and PubSub on the web. And although it's not the first time, right? And actually, I found this recently. In 1998, predating RSS, or RSS 0.92, Microsoft submitted an internet draft to extend HTTP to provide a basic PubSub framework called GENA, or Jenna, I don't know how it would be pronounced, but GENA, General Event Notification Architecture. And it had standard PubSub terms, and it added 4 new methods to HTTP. And it expired eventually. Nothing ever happened. So in 1999, it expired. And the group behind it kind of seemed to disappear. However, the methods and protocol ended up in the WebDAV implementation for exchange, which is interesting. Anyway, but then in 2000, RSS 0.92 was released. 5 years later, it got a nice icon and had widespread adoption. And it started with blog feeds and then comment feeds, but then it exploded into Twitter feeds and photo feeds and activity feeds and event feeds and bookmark feeds, and then even feeds of feeds. So the name feeds is kind of nice. It kind of makes you think of the telecom world of data coming directly to you. But we know that's not how it works, right? Instead, we have to go request the data, and then it gives it to us, and we do this over and over. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? You've heard this before. This is polling. And feeds made sense in a world where the feed reader ran on the desktop and couldn't be pushed to over HTTP. But of course now we have, it seems like the majority of feed consumption happens from other web applications on servers, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. And even most of our feed readers today, Google Reader, are web-based applications. So we've had some, incremental solutions proposed. SUP, which is the Simple Update Protocol. It increases the efficiency of consuming large amounts of feeds. However, it's based on polling still, and is essentially yet another feed. So I couldn't help but to think of this. So Evan and Kellen gave a great talk a while back about this push issue, and their proposed solution was XMPP, of course, right? How many of you support XMPP? Nobody. OK, that's cool. So I have a condensed version of their talk in case you missed it. The slides kind of speak for themselves. Polling sucks. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Let me know when something changes. OK, thanks, bye. XMPP PubSub, thank you. Questions? Yeah. So that was their talk. Pretty great point. Polling sucks, and XMPP is a pretty good solution for data streams, right? But it's kind of heavyweight, and it does a lot and makes for a decently complex little system. Luckily, it's not that hard to use anymore with today's libraries, but I mean, if you look at it, it's complicated, and you have to, well, I don't really want to get into the whole XMPP thing, because the point is that it's not really XMPP versus webhooks. Not really. So Evan and Kellen did point out that there are extremes when it comes to data streams. Most data streams will probably fall somewhere in between fast and furious and small and infrequent. And I guess XMPP is pretty well suited for the fast and furious feeds. So Joshua Schachter, who's not here, I guess, no. He responded to that talk in a blog post. He said he basically suggested webhooks as an alternative, saying HTTP callbacks, right? So he says falls comfortably between polling and XMPP, and I agree, and I think that they can cover most use cases pretty well. I guess though the interesting thing is a lot of people are saying webhooks, it's the new posh way to say callback. I think what differentiates webhooks from just saying it's an HTTP callback is that it's user-defined. And so we'll get into that in a bit. But moving on with this push stuff, we've got get pinged, which is a standard for discovering and subscribing to content changes. And they let you use webhooks or XMPP, which is nice. And it's a good idea. But like Gina, a spec alone doesn't really change the world. So yeah, although implementation so on the other hand, you have pure implementation. We have a service like GNIP, which is their main goal is to stop polling as a service, and so they also kind of transform protocol mechanisms. So you can pick your own protocol and mechanism for getting data streams, no matter what the feed publisher is publishing. So although they recently dropped support to consume XMPP for interesting reasons, making webhooks their primary push mechanism for consuming data. In case you're not familiar, a quick example, if I wanted to get dig updates via webhooks, Gnip will pull dig for me and invoke my callback with the content as the new updates come in. I could even pull Gnip for dig updates, and although that seems redundant, it helps ease the load on dig because Gnip can cache and allows Gnip to provide filtering functionality and whatever else they want to do to add value to this. And yet another example might be if Twitter provides an XMPP stream, but I already have polling set up, so Gnip would let me poll instead of integrate XMPP. So that's Gnip. In promoting webhooks, I sort of look up to the way microformats work in values in process. It's a very sort of ground-up, grassroots effort, and it's taking existing popular use patterns and then making that a convention. So it's sort of letting. That's why there isn't like a spec around webhooks. Because first of all, I think it's too general of a thing to write spec for. You can write specs for more specific things on top of it, but I would rather let interesting implementations come up, and then we can develop, as we explore the possibilities, then we can take the best practices from there, instead of trying to try and think of every possible use case beforehand and encode it in a document. But also, microformats can be viewed as an alternative to XML and RDF. And Tontek is a big microformats evangelist. In comparing microformats and XML RDF, he says, well, here's a new language we want you to learn, and now you need to output these additional files on your server, and it's a hassle. Microformats lowers the barrier to entry. So I thought that was kind of similar to webhooks versus XMPP. So I told him about webhooks, and he's like, "What are they?" And I said, "Push over HTTP," because I was trying out simple ways to explain webhooks. And he says, "How are they different than XMPP?" And I said, "Well, they're just a lightweight alternative. They lower the barrier to entry." And he said, "Good. XMPP needs a competitor." And this was encouraging coming from Tontek, because when he talks, you listen. If for no other reason, then he gets the chicks. Unfortunately, XMPP, well, at least in webhooks case, XMPP has many features and proposals to do PubSub and stuff that things that webhook doesn't do out of the box because it's just making an HTTP request. So it's not a messaging protocol. So in order to do PubSub with webhooks, you need to have more implemented, and that's something that Brad Fitzpatrick and Brett Slatkin are doing with PubSub HubHub, which they recently shared at an XMPP meetup, and which was recorded, and there was some weird drama about like webhooks versus XMPP. But anyway, the point is that push is good, and now there's finally some demand for it. For example, I don't know what would happen if Gino was proposed again now, but we have some good solutions, and XMPP seems to be ideal when you need it, but webhooks generally do the job, and they're easier to implement, so you might as well default to webhooks unless you really need XMPP. But I wanted to frame this talk as not about push, because that's not what it's about. It's just a nice way to get the social media kids into bed with webhooks. But hooks are really about more than PubSub and notifications, and that's why they're called webhooks, not web notifications or something. So instead of push, I was more drawn to the pipes metaphor, which I'm sure we've all heard of for the web. I wanted to integrate and orchestrate the web applications I use, conceptually similar to Unix pipelining. So I thought about it, and I know there's not actually pipes in this screenshot, but pipes are a pretty amazing feature that let you get more out of the commands that you're using by letting you chain them together. And it sort of lets you program without programming, combining commands in a way that that wasn't necessarily intended by the author. So you get some neat, emergence, right? And it was all from really simple infrastructure, right? It was programs have input and output, and this was made available to the user to reroute however they wanted, and that's piping, and that's the model that I used. Well, So it's kind of interesting because you have all these simple little programs that a lot of them, aren't very useful by alone. But when you start chaining them together, you have something that might be more useful than the sum of the parts. And that kind of helped put forth the Unix philosophy, or they were made because of the Unix philosophy to encourage building these kinds of small composable commands. But it doesn't work without the output, right? It just breaks. Like, what's the point? And that's conceptually how I'm viewing the web and web applications, because you can talk to web apps, you can talk to web applications, you can make requests to them, and they can give you stuff back when you request it. But otherwise, they can't really talk to us or anything else really. So it's not that they can't; it's just that they don't, because we need to start putting something like hooks in so that they can. And so these roles seem to be best played by mechanisms that use the protocol that the web is built on, HTTP. So REST and webhooks. Makes sense, right? This is a backhoe, and it's a front loader plus an excavator. So we want to combine web applications like we can on the command line to get more than the sum of the parts. And webhooks open up this possibility, but like web APIs, they need to be implemented. I hit a button. So, for example, imagine Basecamp with a bunch of hooks for events, right? Like a project is finished, a to-do is completed, a milestone is created. These are kind of significant events in the system. The idea is that if you let users write handlers that are just web scripts, all they are is a URL, then you can give that to Basecamp, and then Basecamp can call it, and because it's code on the other side, it can basically do anything from there. So imagine this is a URL that points to a Google App Engine handler, or app-jet, or just a PHP script on hosting. Like hosting, CGI-powered hosting is completely commoditized. You can just get it for free practically. From there, you can integrate it with other services or make a phone call or order pizza or whatever, because it's code, and code can do anything, right? So, for example, all these applications, Slim Timer, Remember the Milk, and Basecamp, they all, so this is one use case, they all have their respective specialized talents, but they all work around to-dos. And so there's like a duplication of data there, right? So if you put hooks on all their CRUD events, then you can use their existing APIs to create and delete stuff, combined with hooks to basically kind of dumbly create and delete this that representation of that to do on these other systems. It kind of works pretty well, and it's kind of dumb, but it's magically works in real time. So you're not having to recreate stuff, and it's kind of nice. So webhooks enable service integration, which is an interesting idea. Or I should say ad hoc, because it's sort of like letting the user integrate your services with each other, because usually you would have to hard code these things. And so this brings new composability to web applications. And it's based on the idea that web URLs can run code, and code can do anything. So when I first thought about this, it was the cheap PHP hosting that that was all over, and I thought, well, that's great, that's simple, but it could be even simpler. So you have paste bins like these, and they're made to share formatted code or whatever. So you can put in some code and ask a question, and you get a URL, and you can say where's the data stored? I don't get it. And so I was thinking about the same thing, but instead you write code, right? And this is before App Engine and app-jet and all this stuff. This was just my model for how something like this would work. And then so instead of just giving you a URL to view it, you get a URL to run it. And in this case, it's if you can see the code, it's checking what operation it is. If a project is completed, then it sets up some variables and then sends a message to the mailing list saying, let's get drunk, meet in the break room. So you take that URL and just give it to Basecamp. And so then now all of a sudden, when you finish a project, everybody meets for shots in the break room. And like I said, we have this now with AppJet, which is made by ex-Googlers, but it's kind of nice. You just hit a button, write code, hit save, share the URL, and it's JavaScript, which is not bad. Obviously, there's App Engine, and although it's a little bit more involved than AppJet for quick handlers, although this could very easily be fixed by making something like AppJet on top of App Engine that makes it easier to just like write code and get a URL. And then there's other stuff like Ruby, Rails hosts like Heroku, and all this. So another thing that I've been working on, playing around with this idea, is an extension that's playing with how end users might interact with webhooks, because I'm not being very specific about this, right? Because it's sort of like up to how people implement it. A lot of people have a text field in their settings that say, what is the URL for this event? This extension was kind of built on the assumption that it detects some markup on the page to discover webhooks, assuming that there is such a thing, and then like for example, saying that there's new photos from your contacts on Flickr, and if you want to do something when it happens, then you just click that event, and what it could do is then pop up a little window with a little box. You could just write code and hit save, and it will automatically post that to AppJet, register the handler with that web service, assuming that there's a standard protocol, and it's done. Like you've just extended Flickr in line with using it, and that's really neat. So of course it requires again like a standard protocol for registering handlers and all this, but that's something we can figure out, right? It's not that hard, and of course you can go back and go to that event again, and you can see your code and you can change the code, and that's kind of cool. So real world examples, I first exposed SVN hooks through DevJavu using webhooks. It's just post-commit, pre-commit, text box you put in the URL. Pre-commit was neat. If the URL returned, I think 400, then it would not allow the commit to continue. A friend of mine, CTO at PBWiki, I talked about him so much, and I kind of used PBWiki as a hypothetical example that he decided to implement them. And so he gave a little talk, and he really liked what he found. He put hooks for everything, like when you log in and when you log out, when you edit a page, revert a page, delete a page, comment on a page. And he thought it was really fun. I'm not sure if it's made it to production, but again, he said it's really cool. And he was one of the people that were like, I don't know about this, like a lot of things. The idea silently spread to the Rails guys. If you've seen Lighthouse, it's an issue tracking system, and they use them. Tobias used them in Shopify, which is a hosted shopping cart application, and he's revamping their API to have more webhooks because they're very cool. And they were one of the earliest adopters, and very recently they had their 1-year anniversary using webhooks. They're very happy with them. Google Code recently caught up with the other code hosts by providing post-commit hook, and it was very well done. Good job. And so you also seem to solve some interesting problems like authentication. HMAC signatures seem to be a good way to do it. GitHub, another popular one. They were another early adopter, and people really liked them on GitHub. They have their post-receive hook, which is basically post-commit, and users have used it to integrate, notifying mailing lists or chat, or working with other project management tools, or triggering continuous integration, running tests, whatever, builds, and that's all very cool. And they were so successful for ad hoc integration with whatever the users wanted that they decided to formalize it into something, because everybody's having to repeat the code or, copy the script and share it with someone else. So they made it very easy. They basically pulled in the stuff that was being integrated the most and built it into their service. So they have service hooks, built-in service integration. But the cool thing is the way they did it. Because they had this existing webhook infrastructure, the way they integrate these external services like Lighthouse and Campfire, they're just little applets or web scripts running in a separate web server locally, so they can manage it, and it's using their existing webhook stuff. So it doesn't actually go out to the internet. It goes locally, and then they can manage the source and support it. And it's really neat because they made that open source. So if you want to write your own handler for integrating GitHub with a completely new web service, then you can fork their project, write a new handler, push it back to them, and they can look it over. They're really simple scripts, and then they can deploy it and support it. It's really cool. And this is, I don't see why this can't be the standard model for service integration. It's just so great and nice. So another example of, so now that they're getting more popular, there's now webhook consumers. So on the other end, like I figured, well, eventually there will be services, once we figure out some standardization and stuff, there will be services on the other end to consume hooks. So you can just, take some service URL and put it in a services webhook, and it will work directly. But I figured that'll be a while, and for now, people, the advanced users that are using this, they can write their own scripts, right? But so this happened to come about. Run Code Run, it's continuous integration service. It just works with GitHub. That's how they work. You put in their URL into their post-receive hook, and it'll run your continuous integration on their service, which is really neat. In fact, you can sign up with Run Code Run by just taking their URL and putting it into your GitHub project. And of course I mentioned PayPal, and webhooks make so much sense because it's not really about notification. They say it's instant payment notification, but the point is that it's about integrating, right? It's integrating it with the rest of your shipping infrastructure or label printing or whatever. In fact, I don't have a slide here, but there's a whole other service that lets you manage post-payment operations. And the way it works is they give you a URL to put in the IPN for PayPal, and then that's how they get all the data on all your transactions, and then you can manage them in a nice interface, since PayPal's kind of a pain, and do all this extra cool stuff. And it's like there wasn't even an API. It's like all based on webhooks. One webhook, too. So that's what they're really great for, even though they can be used for like pushing content updates, which, whatever. Jot is another example of a webhook implementer that doesn't know it yet. They parse voice over the phone, so you can do stuff with it, like post to Twitter, post to your blog, whatever. They do it with, they call them links, which are just hooks. You basically, if you want to create a new link for Jot, you just give them a URL, and they post the parsed text to it, and then you can do whatever you want. So the Twitter one, Remember the Milk, all these things, all they do is it's a script that takes the data and then uses the API and posts it. So that's neat. So it became obvious that making adapter services so that you can adapter services that are useful in specific cases, for example, mail, if you want to get mail and parse it in your application without having to deal with like send mail and dealing with MIME-crap or whatever. Like if you want, like you're prototyping and you want to like accept email in your application, I built this thing called Mailhook that's like anything. You set this up with an MX record, and then you say anything sent to this domain will get posted to this URL. And it was a very simple system. And it seems like other protocols could be added to that as an input into the webhook ecosystem. So SMTP2 Web is basically the same thing, although it's interesting because it was made by the Google App Engine community. It's another way to accept mail because Google App Engine doesn't accept mail right now. And webhooks were the obvious solution, just an HTTP callback. And then Rick Olson from Lighthouse has an open source version that will also do XMPP, and he uses that for Lighthouse. But the SMTP Web one is interesting because it was made because of the limitations of Google App Engine. In fact, there was a lot of these like micro web services, like a cron service where you just register a URL for it to post to that at some particular time in the future, so that you could do cron stuff with App Engine. And then before there was image stuff, there was like these really focused image manipulation things. And it was kind of like the first glimpse at what small focused, micro web services that are like the equivalent of grep and cat and word count and stuff on the command line. And so I would imagine, if there is the infrastructure for that kind of piping on the web, then you would get more of those kinds of small focused web services. And then there's Martin and Andy, two guys in the UK that love webhooks. They built this thing called the Spaghetti Junction at a hack day, and it evolved into Switch Hub, which I really love. And I figured this sort of thing would emerge, but I didn't think it would happen until webhooks were more popular. It's kind of like the Pastebin. It's a consumer because it gives you URLs that you can put into various systems, but then it basically routes it to various outputs, like post IRC or email me, and so it starts. Basically what I figured would happen was eventually people would get sick of writing one-off scripts all the time, and so people would make services that would do this kind of stuff for other people, and this is an example of that. But it's kind of nice because you can route things all weird and stuff, but it's very focused on webhooks, and so I like it. And what they're going to do with the inputs and output handlers that you see are very simple scripts that they could implement the same way GitHub does their service integration, so that they can be run as a separate web service locally that can be open sourced, so that the main Switch Hub code can be private, but the handlers are open source, so people can fork it and contribute new ones, and then they can easily just start using them. Switch Hub would benefit, for example, from a built-in input for various other protocols like email, like using Mailhook, but also RSS and other things, maybe Jabber. But instead of having to build it themselves, they can just work with other services to support those kinds of inputs. So, for example, RSS forward, which will take RSS and email to you, they could easily just also have a webhook, and then they can use that and write a handler for Switch Hub, and then you can have RSS as an input to this. So it seems a lot like Yahoo Pipes, only better and real. I don't know. RSS just didn't make sense for all the cool stuff that I really wanted to do. So I started visualizing how, if there was like a graphical user interface to do it, it would probably kind of look like Reason, inspired by virtual rack mounts, and then you can switch to the back and wire everything how you want. Imagine these racks are web services, and they have various events, and you can okay, take this one, and I want the output of this event to go into the input of this one. It will require, obviously standardization or adapters and stuff like this, but it seems possible when the infrastructure is there. You can't really do this unless there is something like an HTTP callback or something to actually get data out that's not something pull-based. So, plugins, one more thing I want to talk about. Before that, though, a story. So the web, was originally a bunch of pages linked together, static content. It's kind of weird to think of that now because of the way the web is now, but what happened was people kept wanting to access other things through HTTP, like in this case, what was it, WAIS? It's before my time. But they wanted to get it, through HTTP, and so they would hack the web servers to do that. And so this was before CGI, and so they decided to standardize this and create the Common Gateway Protocol, which didn't make sense, so they renamed it to CGI. And then as another side tangent in going through these old mailing lists, which is very fun, this was posted on Reddit a while back, but Andreessen proposing the image tag for HTML, and it was weird because people fought it because they said it needed to be more generalized and work for any type of media. But in the end, he just put it in Mosaic, and then that was that, right? And now it's everywhere. So anyway, these pages that were just static content today, because of CGI, because of these hacks and people starting to use it more and more, now for some reason our web is sort of generated by these higher order conceptual nodes that are code. They're apps. All of our web today pretty much is generated by applications, and it's kind of weird how that evolved. So you have these applications, and the difference between these layers is, it's kind of back-end, front-end, but it's not really the same thing. It's subtly different. I'm talking about like applications and the pages they generate. It's function and content. And so it's kind of interesting to think that it was the functionality part. We had to wait for the applications to take over the web for us to really get the two-way content. And so we have the read write web or whatever, and we can like easily publish content on the web. So Web 2.0, whatever, user-generated content. I want user-contributed or democratized functionality, right? That's kind of where the programmability starts coming in. So not only integrating and composing these applications, but also extending applications. So I almost called this section platforms because platforms are really cool. We all love them. That's basically technology in essence. The Facebook platform was pretty cool, I guess. I asked a friend how it worked, and he said webhooks. I was like, what? Sure enough, I mean, at a high level, conceptually, it looks like webhooks to me, right? It's HTTP calling out, using the results of some other application, and brings it in and displays it within Facebook. Essentially extending the functionality of Facebook with these applications. There's not a huge difference between applications and plugins. So, in fact, a few other people have done this, where they actually take the response of these callbacks to affect the logic in their applications. For example, DabbleDB, which is a hosted create online databases, and so for people that shouldn't be using Excel, their plugin API is basically webhooks, and so the kinds of plugins that you can make are derived fields. So I mean, it's like a big spreadsheet, right? And you can do derived fields or whatever. You can create your own custom derived fields that are calculated by your code. And so they made this, and it was like their own standard where they have this metadata thing that basically just points to a URL. And that's a webhook, right? And of course, they compared it to pipes, the simplicity, the natural fit for it. But I think that they should have hooks for all the standard CRUD events, because that would make their application so much more useful. Just the same way that PayPal has a hook for their major event, like you can integrate it with the rest of your workflow, because a lot of these app platforms like Coghead and Salesforce, they're siloed off data processing and the functionality that they provide, when you might have existing stuff that you want to integrate with, and it would be so much easier if they had hooks that you could hook into. Amazon, this was a fairly recent thing. So not only do they have instant order processing notifications for events like order creation, cancellation, ready to ship stuff. Checkout is basically a checkout process that you can use. But they also have these callbacks that actually return stuff, and they use that so that you can use them to calculate shipping costs and taxes and promotions and stuff like this. So they're doing it. I should really find out how they're doing it, because of course people are asking what's the scalability and all this such. IMified, another platform that's using webhooks to let you build bots for IM, basically by calling out to a web script. So just to close, I want to drop some GST on you. The central tenet, a central tenet, is that the value is not in the elements themselves, but the real value is in the interactions and how they work together in systems, and everything is a system. So this is sort of a universal law, maybe. And so this creates, the emergent phenomenon of the system, and it defines its behavior. So if we increase ways to work together and have basically webhooks are basically new ways to interact between applications, that creates new means of combination, increases the degrees of freedom, uncovers new opportunities in business tools and empowerment, which is great. That's what technology is all about. And of course, the vision for a programming paradigm that is the internet or is the web is very compelling, but we're not there yet, because the real programmable web will require webhooks. And that is all I have to say, unless you have questions, which I can answer or try to. Was this interesting? Yeah. Good. Are you going to now put webhooks into all your applications? Yes.
So got a question from a security standpoint.
Yes.
Maybe looked at preventing somebody from going and registering hundreds of thousands of webhooks on some server that they want to, or pointing towards some server that they want to launch a denial of service attack against, and how to prevent that.
That's a very common. So how do you prevent denial of service attacks from registering a bunch of URLs and having them? I mean, so services are going to be in control of, what they're posting to and how often. So some of the implementations I've seen, including the PubSub Hubbub application, are just very careful about that. And they have mechanisms for that that I haven't looked into yet. But it's just being a little bit more smart about how you implement these things. More questions? Yeah?
So I saw a great example of this recently about a Panasonic network camera that's remote controllable. You can change the direction of the lens and so on through the web.
Yeah.
And it has in the setup options a way of saying, post the pictures that you get when motion is detected to the following URL via HTTP hook.
Yep.
It works beautifully.
So
Totally embedded.
part of the bigger vision here, and I call this the programmable web. Oh, so I don't know if I need to repeat that, but I mean that was a really cool. What was it? What was the device?
Panasonic network camera.
It's a network camera that when what was the thing that it detects?
It detects motion.
When motion, it posts. Yeah. And that's really cool. Like, that's a webhook. And it's really cool because that's like a physical thing. A lot of people are talking about, eventually the web will be a web of things, right? And so I call this talk the programmable world of tomorrow because in my mind, the world will become more programmable. So this is an example of that. And programming will be more useful than just doing stuff on the web. And having this kind of universal programmability built in would be really nice. So that is very cool. Questions, comments? Is that it? Okay.